Art Flick, the 9th tire listed in Mike Valla's Founding Flies 43 American Masters. A true Catskill legend called the Sage of the Mighty Schoharie Creek. Now, Flick operated the Westkill Tavern on the banks of the Schoharie from 1934 to 1960. And some true icons of our sport stayed there. You might have heard of Preston Jennings and his book on trout flies published in 1935, or Ray Bergman and Trout published in 1938. A 1972 article in Outdoor Life called The Catskill Fly Tires, Flick said Preston Jennings was his mentor and the reason he got into fly tying. So that's a pretty impressive lineage, just those 3 gentlemen there. But Art Flick, he was actually a pretty modest guy. It was said that he really only claimed to have created 2 flies, the red quill dry fly, which many consider to be his signature fly, and the one I'm about to tie today, his Blacknosed Dace bucktail, which he first introduced in his new Streamside Guide published in 1969. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about this pattern. First being that he tied it on a short shank hook. Now, I know a lot of you might be thinking, well, he probably just tied it on the hooks that were available, but I don't think that's the case. There were plenty of streamer hooks available in the 50s and 60s, so the fact that he chose a short shank, I think that was a conscious decision. And the next interesting thing to note are the materials he chose. We tie the Blacknosed Dace today pretty much with a white, black, and brown bucktail, but he actually used polar bear and black bear or skunk tail for the middle stripe, and then brown bucktail on top. Now, I don't know how common polar bear was in the 50s and 60s. I'm sure it was a lot easier to get than it is today. But I was lucky enough to get a patch from a trader out in Washington State. It was harvested before 1972, so it's completely legal. But this is really interesting stuff. Now, you probably can't tell from looking at this piece. You'll be able to see when I tie it on, but it's actually a pretty translucent hair. So the pattern you're about to see me tie, I'm going to stick to Art Flick's original materials. I'm going to use a polar bear, black bear, and then dyed brown bucktail, and I'm going to be putting it on a short shank hook. Now, I know a lot of you won't have these materials, but what you can learn from this video, aside from how the original Blacknosed Dace was tied, is that there's really no need to get hung up on materials or even hook choices. If you want to change the colors up or change the materials or even change the hook size, go for it. If a legend like Art Flick could come up with a great classic bucktail on a short shank hook with a big gaudy head, then who are we to say you can't do that? So I hope y'all enjoyed this nod to Art Flick in a truly vintage pattern. Let's give it a shot. So there it is in the vise, my recreation of a vintage Art Flick Blacknosed Dace. You can tell this is tied pretty sparse, and it's got a big head. I didn't use UV resin. I went old school with the head cement, but the signature of this fly, I would say, is the short shank. This is a size 8, just a wet fly hook, a 1X long, and I'm going to use black thread, and this is a 140 denier, so a little bit thicker than I normally use. I'll take the base all the way back, and I'm going to catch in a small tuft of red wool yarn. Go ahead and snip it off right here. We'll fluff it out in just a minute. But before I do that, I'm going to catch in some silver Mylar tinsel. I'm catching it in a little bit in front of that yarn. Maybe I can minimize the bump. Probably not. We're probably going to have a bump that we just have to live with. But that's okay. Some of the old ones I've seen, they kind of have it too. Let's take our thread right back up here where we're going to finish our body. Now let's wrap this silver Mylar and touch and turns, maybe overlapping just a little bit, but sometimes overlapping is going to give you a little lump that will carry its way all the way up. We don't necessarily want that, so we're just going to live with that little lump we have right there and then take this the rest of the way up. Now I'm going to go ahead and fluff this out before I start my wing. It might be a little big after I fluffed it out. You see that? That's probably a little bit more than I want. So let's just go in here and give it another little haircut. There we go. I think that's going to work for us. Now here's the fun stuff. Just a small little tuft of polar bear fur. And this one I did put in my stacker. You can see this stuff is almost translucent. It has a little bit of a an off-white, yellowish, and maybe it's off-white because this is such an old piece, but I don't know what it looked like 40 years ago when this bear was harvested. Now, the only pictures I've seen of the Art Flick original did have this laying pretty close to the hook shank, but I'm going to go ahead and put one wrap right up under it because I don't want it going too low. I think that's going to work just fine right there. And of course, if you don't have polar bear, which most folks aren't going to, just use white bucktail. Next thing that Flick called for was black bear or skunk tail. Now let me just show you the difference here. Here's a piece from my skunk, from a skunk's tail, and look at those tips. They're all jagged and really kind of blunt, and that wasn't a bad skunk tail, so I don't necessarily know why he said substitute one of these or the other, because I think they're fairly different. Maybe he was just going with the color. So anyway, I'm going to go with the bear here because I think my bear piece is just a little nicer than my skunk was, and I'm keeping this pretty thin and just a little bit longer than that polar bear. So let's catch this in right there. I think that's going to be fine. I want to do a pinch wrap right here, and if you notice, I started my wing pretty far back from that eye, because I think this thing, we're going to put a big old head on it. And the last part of this wing, just brown bucktail. Still pretty sparse. This might be more than I want, but we're going to put it on there and see. And I did not put this in my stacker. I want the top piece to be a little bit, uneven. It gives you a little bit smoother of a taper maybe, a little more natural look. And I'm going to catch this in just maybe a little bit longer than that black right there. And this will flare up on you if you're not careful. But we're going to be in fine shape right here. It is not flared up on the back yet. And that's about what I want. Maybe I might trim a couple of those short pieces coming off the top, but we'll see. Let's go ahead and trim the front and then work on our head. So do I want to get in here and snip that piece right there, or maybe I just lay a medium wrap down and try to get it flat? I think we're going to be fine right there. And something else you might want to consider, is it laying too low? Because I could lift everything up and put a wrap up under it to kind of prop it up a little bit. But you know what? I don't think I'm going to. I'm going to let it just lay a little bit closer to that shank right there. I'm just going to finish up my head. And how about this? Let's go really old school. Let's do a hand whip finish, just like Art Flick probably did back in his day. So there we go, a near vintage Blacknosed Dace, as Art Flick might have tied it himself, who knows. But you notice a short shank hook, big head, and a fairly sparse wing. So that's it, everybody. I appreciate y'all watching this blast from the past. Y'all take care, and we'll see you next time.